All right, let's get right into it. In this analysis, we're going to do a deep, forensic unpacking of just one single verse from the Qur'an. Al-A'rāf, verse 36. Now, this verse is profound. It speaks directly to our ultimate destiny, and we're not just going to do a surface-level reading. Not at all. Instead, we're going to meticulously dissect the entire theological machine behind it, the complete system of temptation, choice, divine law, and eternal consequence, all as detailed in our source materials. Think of this as an archival deep dive, where we're going to leave no stone unturned as we trace the chain of events from a single act of defiance all the way to the final, stark conclusion that this verse presents.
So, here's our roadmap for this breakdown. We're going to start with the verse of finality itself, just to establish the ultimate consequence we're trying to understand. From there, we'll investigate the declared method of the main antagonist, a concept called agwa. Then, we'll get into the critical nuance of temptation, really separating the big strategy from the subtle tactics. After that, we'll tackle the complex idea of divine respite, making it clear what its purpose is. Then, our focus is going to turn inward, to the battlefield of the soul, to see where this conflict actually goes down. And finally, we'll pull all of these pieces together to understand the mechanics of choice and consequence, linking every single one of these concepts directly back to that finality we saw in verse 36.
Okay, let's start with the verse itself. Al-A'rāf, verse 36. The statement here is one of absolute, unwavering consequence. The text talks about companions of the fire who will abide therein eternally. I mean, the language is totally definitive. There's zero ambiguity. But this eternal outcome, it doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It's presented as the direct, inevitable result of a specific process, a culmination of conscious choices and cultivated states of being. So the real question for our investigation, the one the source material wants us to ask, is this: what are the precise spiritual, psychological, and theological mechanics that lead a soul to this irreversible end?
To really get the human choice that leads to this outcome, the source material forces us to go back and look at the foundational declaration of the antagonist of Satan. In this earlier verse, from the very same chapter, we find the origin story of the entire conflict. He says, "Because you have put me in error, agwaitani, I will surely sit and wait for them on your straight path." Now, this is a critical moment. Look at the shift in responsibility. He doesn't take ownership of his own arrogance. He blames a divine act, agwaitani. And right there, in that moment of blame, he reveals his entire strategy. He vows to use that exact same method, this putting in error, which we're about to define as agwa, against humanity. This sets up the core dynamic: an enemy who refuses to be accountable and now wants to replicate his own fall in everyone else. So our analysis has to start here, with the enemy's own declared plan of attack. So now that we've established the antagonist's original vow, we can move to the first core concept in our analysis. We're going to isolate and really examine the specific method he says he'll use, the act of agwa. Understanding this term isn't just about a simple translation. It's the key that unlocks the entire system of temptation we're looking at. Let's be really precise about what agwa means, just as the source material demands. It's so important to understand that this isn't a strategy of brute force or making someone do something. No, its power is in its subtlety, its sophistication. The source defines it as the comprehensive act of misleading. So let's break that down. First, it's about causing someone to deviate, actively steering them off what's called the straight path. Second, it's about temptation, and not just suggesting something bad, but making it look incredibly desirable. And third, and this is maybe the most critical part, it's the act of presenting falsehood as if it were truth. This isn't just lying, it's building a whole convincing alternate reality. So agwa is really a fundamental strategy of pure, calculated psychological deception. And this passage from our source just illustrates the application of agwa perfectly. You can think of it as a form of psychological warfare. The goal isn't just to suggest a bad deed, it's to fundamentally re-engineer how a person sees reality. The source explains this two-part approach. First, you make falsehood beautiful. The forbidden, the harmful, the destructive, it's all packaged to look attractive, logical, even like the right thing to do. Second, you do the opposite. You make the path of truth look ugly, difficult, and just totally undesirable. This double whammy creates what the source calls a veil, a kind of cognitive and spiritual distortion field that completely obscures reality. And so the person is lured away, not by force, but by their own manufactured desires, making them want to deviate. Okay, so right here, the source material introduces a really critical distinction. This is absolutely essential if we want to understand human accountability in this whole system. We have to recognize that not all temptation is the same. We have to be able to tell the difference between the huge overarching strategy of misguidance and the specific little tactics used to carry out that strategy inside a person's mind.
So to really get the mechanics of this, we have to ask a very specific question. How does this grand external strategy of agua, this war on our perception, actually translate into an internal, personal human experience? Is there a real difference between the strategic declaration of war and the individual tactical engagement on the ground? Well, the source material says yes, absolutely.
This slide lays out the core distinction with incredible clarity. The source carefully separates the master plan, ikhwa, from the specific tactic, waswasa. So let's look at these. Ikhwa is the big strategy, the external act of creating a deceptive environment and twisting reality. Waswasa, on the other hand, is the internal tactic. The word itself suggests a subtle, repetitive, quiet whispering of suggestions, right into the heart and mind. So while ikhwa sets the stage for the war, waswasa is the covert op, the infiltration, the incitement from within. One is a public declaration of war. The other is a secret internal operation targeting our very thoughts.
You know, this whole thing naturally brings up a huge theological question, one that our source material takes on directly. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why is this elaborate system of deception, this ikhwa and waswasa, even allowed to exist? Why does the antagonist get to operate on the battlefield at all? The source material addresses this problem with another very precise term, imhal. This is best translated as divine respite. And it's really important to understand this concept carefully. Imhal is not divine permission. It's not an endorsement of evil. It is specifically a reprieve, a granting of a delay. In the grand cosmic story, it's the limited period of time from that initial fall all the way to the day of judgment during which the antagonist is allowed to operate. It's a temporary allowance for a very specific purpose, not a permanent state of being. But, and this is a huge but, the source is emphatic that this respite, this imhal, is not a blank check for absolute power. It comes with a critical rule of engagement. As this verse makes crystal clear, God explicitly states that Satan has no authority. The word in Arabic is sultan, which means compelling, coercive power, over his sincere servants. His influence is strictly limited to those who choose to follow him. This defines the nature of his power perfectly. It's the power of suggestion, of waswasa, not the power of domination. The ultimate authority to act always stays with the human being. So the source's conclusion here is very precise. Imhal, the divine respite, is the mechanism that creates the perfect conditions for a meaningful test of human free will. It sets up an arena with real choices, real stakes, and real consequences. The source makes a sharp distinction between this and the concept of idhin, which would mean divine permission and an actual endorsement of the evil itself. In this framework, God allows the conditions for the test to exist, but he doesn't sanction or approve of the path of failure. The presence of a real tempter operating under these very strict rules is what makes the human choice for truth and sincerity a truly significant and worthwhile act.
Okay, so we've defined the external forces, Satan's strategy of ighwa and his tactic of waswasa, all happening within a framework of divine respite or imhal. Now, the source shifts its focus from the external world to the internal one, to the actual arena where the choice is made and the battle is either won or lost. The source material now zooms our focus in on the precise location of this conflict. And it's not fought on some external physical battlefield. The ultimate arena, the epicenter of this entire struggle, is the internal landscape of the human soul, the nafs. Every external strategy of ikhwa and every internal tactic of waswasa is aimed at this one single target. And nafs is a big term. It includes our consciousness, our basic desires, our ego, and our higher spirit. It's this complex internal territory that Satan is trying to influence and ultimately conquer. But the source encourages us to get even more specific. Within this general idea of the soul, it identifies a particular state or aspect as the main entry point for temptation. This is the nafs al-amara, which translates to the soul that commands evil. It's so important to get this. This isn't the entirety of the human soul, but it's a powerful base inclination that exists within it. This is the part of our consciousness that's naturally susceptible to waswasa, the part that leans toward instant gratification, arrogance, and selfish desire. The whole tactic of waswasa is designed specifically to target, amplify, and empower the voice of the nafs al-amara, trying to make it the dominant force inside a person's head. However, and this is absolutely crucial, the source emphasizes that humanity is not left defenseless on this internal battlefield, not even close. We are equipped with a formidable arsenal. So let's look at these tools one by one. First, we have the aql, or intellect.
This is our faculty of reason, analysis, discernment. It lets us recognize deception and weigh consequences. Second, we have ikhtiyar, or free will. This is the executive authority of the soul, the ultimate power to choose one path over another, no matter the internal whispers or external pressures. Third, we have external support through divine guidance, prophets, messengers, and holy books that give us a clear, objective roadmap. And finally, maybe most profoundly, the source talks about the fitra. This is our innate, primordial disposition, a kind of spiritual hardwiring that gives every human a foundational knowledge of God, truth, and morality. Together, these tools form our defense against the strategy of Igwa. And now we've reached the final section of our analysis. This is where we synthesize everything we've been dissecting. We're going to trace how the external strategy of Igwa, the internal tactic of waswasa, the time frame of imhal, and the internal battlefield of the nafs all come together to produce the exact outcome described in that first verse we looked at, Al-A'rāf 36. The source brings our attention right back to the precise language of the verse. The condemnation isn't for some vague idea of being evil, but for two specific conscious choices. The first is denying the signs, an active, willful rejection of the evidence and the guidance provided. This is a failure to use the aql, the intellect, properly. The second is behaving with arrogance towards those signs. This attitude of superiority and self-sufficiency is what stops the signs from even being considered in the first place. It's the veil that blocks both the external guidance and the internal voice of the fitra. And here it is. The source gives us the final, crucial link that connects human action to this entire theological framework. Arrogance, it argues, is the internal veil that we willingly place over our own God-given aql, or intellect. It perfectly mirrors the original mistake of Satan himself, and it's what functionally blinds us to the truth. And denial? That's the ultimate outcome of this arrogance. It's the final conscious act of using our ikhtiyar, our free will, to say yes to the waswasa even when the clear evidence of the signs is right there. It's the moment an individual formally chooses to accept the deceptive reality of ikhwa as their own. And so our forensic analysis of this one verse comes to a close. We've systematically looked at the external strategy of the tempter, the divine rules of engagement that govern this conflict, and the internal battlefield of the soul. We've listed the tools of deception and the arsenal of our defense. After examining this entire intricate system, the mechanics of temptation and the divine framework of choice, the source material leads us to an inescapable conclusion. The ultimate responsibility for where we end up doesn't lie with the tempter, and it doesn't lie with some flaw in the divine plan. It rests squarely and irrevocably on our individual human choice.